Peanuts cartoons, Charlie Brown. In one of those cartoons, Linus says to Lucy, "Why are you always so eager to criticize me?" And Lucy says, "I have a knack for seeing other people's faults." And Linus says, "What about your own faults?" Lucy says, "I have a knack for overlooking them." I have a knack for overlooking my own faults also from time to time. Now think about this. What if you were walking through that near the Vatican, out there in front of the Vatican where the Pope lives? The Pope comes running out, grabs you and gives you a big hug and says, "I love you." Okay, what if the Queen comes out and you're in the gardens in London and she just grabs you and gives you a hug and says, "I love you," even though you're an American? And what if you're in the Rose Garden visiting the White House and the president comes out and says, gives you a big hug, and I know he likes to give hugs, and says, "I love you. Your faith is so pure and so childlike." What would you say? Like the child in the gospel story and the disciples, I would be dumbfounded to be hugged and touched and honored by such highly esteemed people. Did the child have any idea who Jesus was? Do I have any idea what it's like to be hugged by a mighty God? I have glimpses of this through hugs and kindnesses and hugs from others, but by choosing to hug a child, Jesus shows us that the most vulnerable are important. In Jesus' time, children had little status in their community or family. A minor child was on par with a slave, and only after reaching maturity could a child be free enough to inherit a family estate or do the other things that adults could do. But a child had to reach maturity. The children in antiquity lived in a time of terror. Infant mortality was sometimes as high as 30%. Another 30% of live births were dead by age 6. And after that, another 60% died before they were 16. Those are pretty big figures. Not many kids made it very far. Children suffered greatly. This was a time of famine and war and disease and dislocation. And we see that today also. An orphan was the weakest and most vulnerable person in society. And survival to adulthood was a cause for celebration. And Jesus soaks in the goodness of a child to indicate the openness that we are called on to use as we share the hugs that we get from Jesus. Sometimes we forget to talk about those. We would say, "Oh, the president hugged me." When would we say Jesus hugged me? Theologian Caroline Lewis writes, Mark is pointing to something very important and something essential about believing in Jesus, because God becoming human, the incarnation, upended every assumption of greatness that the world deemed as definitive. Because God becoming human decided that greatness is not about separation, but solidarity, not about better than, but relationship, not about self-adulation, but empowerment and encouragement of the other. Greatness is determined by weakness and vulnerability, by service and sacrifice, by humility and honor, by truthfulness and faithfulness. We are called to live this kind of greatness. We are called to embody this kind of greatness so the world can witness the true meaning of love born out of greatness. This is hardcore theology. Another theologian writes, this gospel is the most scandalous of gospels in Mark. By identifying so radically with a child and embracing that road to rejection and suffering and dying and being raised, Jesus is redefining both greatness and goodness and godness. It's not glory in the honor of Caesars or the presidents or the Pope or the Queen, but in the vulnerability of a child, a stranger, a foreigner. That's where we encounter God. And I'm thinking about those people under the bridge. I'm thinking about people who want to live in a nation that is free. I'm thinking about people who were here before we were. We took their children away from them. If this seems edgy, as theologians suggest it might be, then could it be that the disciples' willingness or unwillingness to embrace the vulnerable God is at the point in which Jesus finds them? What is a true disciple like? Like every one of us. We are true disciples. We struggle with right and wrong. We struggle with who's in, who's out. We struggle whether to help someone or not. We struggle with who gets what, who has enough food, who has a home, who is on drugs, and why should I care? And how can I take care of everyone in need? Is a hand out more important than a hand up? And it's so easy to look at their faults. Slavery is still present today. Slavery, particularly in the sex industry, as well as promises that are made to immigrants who are given jobs that turn into back-breaking long hours. A van picks them up and takes them to work, and the van takes them back to an apartment, and they have to live there, and they have to do what they're told, or they will never get their papers back. And I learned about this in a human trafficking group that I was in. We are made in the image of God. How can we traffic anyone? How can we traffic children and allow that to go on? We believe that this God is love, not finding our faults, not looking at our faults and telling us what our faults are. We are nagged by Jesus to tell our thoughts that when we are offered opportunities, we can rearrange our thinking from ourselves to others, to the very vulnerable. That's where Jesus will be, playing games with the kids in the rough neighborhoods that we might fear walking into. Shane Claiborne started a new monastic community in South Philadelphia. And one of the things that I read about that he did, and he's a great guy, I've read some of his books and I've heard him speak. His community went into a neighborhood in South Philly and they picked up the needles that were in the playground. They put those needles, used needles from drugs, put them in clear mason jars and filled the mason jars with clear glue, sealed them, took them to the city council. There were hundreds of jars of needles. They took them to the city council to say, our playgrounds need to be cleaned up, and this is why. They took the time to do that to keep children safe in their neighborhood. Listen to your heart. Listen to the wisdom of the whispers of God. They're there. Hug a child. Nice, we have one here today. Hug a child. Hug a child of a different race or a different nationality. Overlook the faults of others, just like Lucy. And be not afraid. The Queen, the Pope, and the President are willing to hug you. And Jesus always has hugs for each one of us. God's love is painfully unconditional, whether we use conditions to love others or not. Amen. Amen.